It has been a busy week for the Georgia grand jury investigating possible election crimes by Donald Trump. Here's what former Attorney General Eric Holder said last night on this program about that investigation. On Georgia, everything that Fani Willis is investigating is also a federal crime of election interference in Georgia. Is that the kind of situation where the Justice Department, the Attorney General would look at that and say, you know what, local district attorney has it covered. We don't have to take any action there?
Well, I'll speak for myself. Given what the former president tried to do, along with his co-conspirators, his Confederates, it seems to me that federal charges have to be brought here. Yeah, there is certainly overlap, but I think the bringing of federal charges, the Attorney General of the United States, the Justice Department saying that this is not something that we will countenance, I think is an important part of the equation that Merrick Garland and the Justice Department are going to have to go through.
On Tuesday, Georgia's Republican Governor Brian Kemp testified for 3 hours under oath to the grand jury. Also on Tuesday, a Florida judge rejected an attempt by Michael Flynn to avoid testifying to the Georgia grand jury. On Wednesday, the Georgia grand jury heard testimony from Cassidy Hutchinson, the aide to former Trump White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. Cassidy Hutchinson testified to the January 6th committee about, among other things, what she knew about the phone call by Donald Trump to Georgia's Secretary of State that provoked the grand jury investigation.
All I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have.
In other important legal news in Georgia, Senator Raphael Warnock's campaign won an important victory today when a Fulton County judge ruled that the Secretary of State cannot prohibit early voting for the runoff election on the Saturday after Thanksgiving. Joining us now is Gwen Keyes Fleming. She's the former district attorney of DeKalb County, Georgia, neighboring county to Fulton County. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. I want to go to that point that I discussed with Eric Holder last night. In 24 hours, the story's changed a lot because now there's Jack Smith. Now we know who we're talking about. Knowing what you know about the evidence in Georgia, does it include overlapping evidence for a federal investigation? And would you expect Jack Smith to be investigating what Donald Trump was doing on the phone with the Georgia Secretary of State?
Well, I think that's something we've got to wait and see. Certainly, he'll have all of the tools to be able to investigate the federal crimes that may have resulted from what happened in Georgia. And I do think there is some overlap, but obviously Mr. Smith will have a much broader platform and scope to investigate, to include all of the things that happened outside of Fulton County and outside of Georgia. Those things are outside of the Fulton County District Attorney's jurisdiction.
So, you know, we know that you're a colleague of Fani Willis and you're a friend of hers, and you've worked kind of side by side, county to county, as prosecutors. Would you say that you think you approach the law in the same way that she does?
I think there's a lot of similarities. Certainly, calling in a special grand jury was an important step. It allows her not only to have the subpoena power that we've talked about previously on this show, but it also gives her a preview into what the residents of her county and a potential criminal grand jury, as well as a potential regular jury, if we happen to get that far, a jury of 12 that would determine guilt or innocence. It gives a preview as to how ordinary folks, non-lawyers, folks that are not in law enforcement, would view this evidence.
So you and some other legal co-authors published a document on Monday with the Brookings Institution, an analysis of the possible criminal liability Donald Trump could be facing in Fulton County. And here's what you listed: solicitation to commit election fraud, intentional interference with performance of election duties, interference with primaries and elections, conspiracy to commit election fraud, making false statements, improperly influencing government officials, forgery in the first degree, criminal solicitation, racketeering. Is it possible that Fani Willis would see this evidence in a way dramatically different from the way you look at it?
Well, I think anything is possible. And remember, the Brookings report is based on the information that is publicly available. So what was in the press, what we've heard people talk about in the press, what we've heard from testimony or through testimony from the January 6th investigation in Congress. Fani has much more power. She has the power to actually bring witnesses in before the grand jury to subpoena documents that can either support or controvert their testimony. And so while we are passing judgment or providing analysis on what is available for public consumption, I am quite sure there is a lot that we don't know yet, and only Fani and her team know. So she's going to be able to evaluate all of that first level evidence, actual evidence, and make a decision as to whether charges are appropriate. And if so, which ones out of the list that you just read might be viable in this particular case.
You also entertained possible Trump defenses, as Andrew Weissman did in his federal document for the documents case. He drafted something similar, and I didn't find anything on the defense side of the presentation that seemed convincing.
Well, and again, that's something we're going to have to wait and see. We laid out some of the most likely defenses that we think a defense team would bring up, including an attempt to remove the case to federal court, claims of immunity. And as we can tell, again, based on public evidence, Fani and obviously the defense team may have access to other evidence that is not publicly known yet. So there may be new and different defenses or new and different twists, but that is something that is all going to unfold as we hear from the special grand jury when they release their report, and whether there are indictments, and if so, for which charges and against whom. Remember, it's not just the former president here. We looked at several other folks in his circle that may potentially have some criminal liability.
What is the potential timetable in front of us now that would end with a possible indictment in this process?
Well, again, remember, Fani has a full 12 months from, I think it's June, to run this grand jury. I think publicly she has said she would like to try to wrap it up this year. I think that depends a lot on how things go with some of the remaining subpoenas and witnesses that she's trying to get to testify. But she has a sitting criminal grand jury for the November-December term. So if the special grand jury issues a report in the next 6 weeks or so that would recommend charges with a little bit of turnaround time in terms of creating the documents, Fani might be able to present an indictment as early as this year. And again, that's all based on what evidence she has and whether she has enough to actually establish all of the elements for the charges.
And just quickly before we go, is this the kind of presentation where all possible indictments would come out at once, or there might be a set of indictments, just for example, against Rudy Giuliani, and then later indictments against someone else?
Well, and again, I think that's a strategic decision. Certainly, if we see a RICO charge of any kind, I can imagine that would be all-encompassing to allow the DA to tell the full story and everybody's part in it, based on her allegations. But it's always possible to have separate indictments, particularly if you're looking to see if someone is interested in either flipping for the state or you want to provide them some immunity. And so you create that separation to be able to do so.
Former Georgia District Attorney Gwen Keyes Fleming, your guidance has been invaluable in this case and will continue to be. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Coming up, Donald Trump threatened her, but she persisted. People came to her home to threaten her and her family, but she persisted. And she just won re-election to an office that is on the front line in the defense of democracy in this country. And she will join us in tonight's Winner's Circle next.
Do you struggle with occasional nerve aches in your hands or feet? Try Nervive Nerve Relief from the world's #1 selling nerve care company. Nervive contains alpha-lipoic acid to
chest, neck, and back. It goes on clear. No mess. Just soothing comfort. Try Vicks VapoStick.
If you were an elected official, Would you run for re-election after this happened to you?
One night in December 2020, I was about to put my son to bed when dozens of individuals descended upon our home. Growing in numbers over the course of an hour, they stood outside my front door, waking my neighbors, shouting obscenities and graphic threats into bullhorns. To this day, these images and this memory of that evening still haunts me. This was not the first, nor was it the last time some time or a group of people showed up at my home or threatened me, my staff, or many of the hundreds of local election officials in our state.
It should not take courage to be the Secretary of State of Michigan. It should not take courage to run for re-election as Secretary of State. But it does. After being personally threatened by Donald Trump and after Donald Trump endorsed an election liar to run against her, Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson ran for re-election and ran to save democracy in the process. And joining us tonight in the winner's circle is Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who won her re-election with 56% of the vote and a 600,000 leading vote margin. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. It was a long road to get to this re-election victory with, I'm sure, for you, some doubt at some point about whether you should continue on that road because it involves so much danger.
Yeah, well, thank you, first, Lawrence, for having me and for the recognition of what we've achieved in this office, what voters have supported. But yes, there are certainly times where all of us, the governor, the AG, and I will look at each other and say, why are we doing this again? But then we know, I know. I mean, for me, it's because in 1965, people stood on the foot of a bridge in Selma, Alabama, so that we could have a Voting Rights Act. I want to continue their work. And I know that requires courage and sacrifice. And it truly is an honor to get to play this role at a time when democracy is under attack and help, I hope, guide our democracy through this storm so that it can emerge stronger and more robust on the other side.
So, and also in your state, there was the plot to kidnap the governor, murder the governor. Surely friends of yours, possibly family members of yours at that time, said to you, why continue in this role?
Yes, and they continuously ask, and I'd say, I look at my son and say, because I want him to grow up in a democracy. I mean, we saw how close we came. I saw very clearly how close we came to having a presidential election overturned in 2020. And the only thing that stood in between that reality, that possibility, and democracy prevailing were people of integrity on both sides of the aisle, standing firm and making sure that the people's will prevailed. So it does require people, all of us, to stand in and even run towards the fire if that's what it takes to protect the very foundation of who we are in this country, our American democracy. And again, at the end of the day, I'm proud to be able to do it. And I'm proud to be able to show my son and the next generation of voters what defending and preserving democracy really requires from all of us.
So the good news, bad news here is that we never before covered elections for state secretary of state in any state, anywhere in the union. So the good news is people now know what that job is. They know how important that job is in a way that I never knew how important it was until this year.
Yeah, I mean, we saw in the 2000 election how a Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, stood in the way of a recount. We saw in other elections in 2004, Ohio Secretary of State Ken Blackwell didn't put enough voting machines in Cleveland and Columbus. So we've seen behind the scenes, but perhaps not under the spotlight, how important these roles are. It's why I wrote a book on this office in 2008, because I want voters to know that they hold in their hands in every election the ability to ensure we're electing people of integrity to these roles. People like Brad Raffensperger, who will say no when the president of the United States calls and asks him to find votes. And then if we don't stand vigilant, then we risk losing these offices and our democracy to those who won't stand by the will of the people. And that's really what the choice was facing voters in this election.
The Honorable Jocelyn Benson, thank you for persisting, and thank you for joining us tonight in the winner's circle.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's an honor.
Thank you.